The Geopolitics and Empire podcast is joined once again by my dear and former professor from my alma mater, the Geneva School of Diplomacy. He's a former senior lawyer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, former UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, and much more. His new book is Building a Just World Order from Clarity Press, which I just finished reading and is very good. It's good to see you again, Professor de Zayas. How is Geneva?
Well, Geneva is cloudy, foggy. My wife today, she just came back. She was racketing in the mountains in the snow, and she sent me photos to make me envious. Up in the mountains is just gorgeous, just blue sky and sunny. And but here in Geneva is clammy. It's 2 degrees, and feels like -2. In any event, we are preparing for the 4th Advent, and as I said, have a concert tonight, and I have another concert on Sunday, and still 2 rehearsals before the final. As the case may be, yes, I'm glad you mentioned my book, because it is gradually getting reviews, and I'm hoping that the 25 principles of international order that I formulate, that they will be taken seriously, at least by some politicians, and some senators, and some parliamentarians, and not only in the United States. I mean, I would very much welcome AMLO, López Obrador. It would be great if López Obrador were to get a copy of the book, and some of his assistants would read it and do him a executive summary and how to use it, because I think the 25 principles of international order could be used by many heads of state.
I did have a question about AMLO as well, and hopefully we can get to it. And so let's get into your book and look at some of the troubles of our time. In a recent interview, you said that you think many UN agencies are doing a good job. And in your book, you say that it is difficult to imagine the world without the UN, that it prevented World War III. And maybe just to start, I think listeners will like this. Maybe I'm picking some of the juicier quotes from your book. You've referred to different threats to democracy and the UN. And you mentioned misplaced priorities of governments and international organizations. And in the beginning of your book, and in a later section, you write, quote, future mandate holders will have to address the impact on a democratic and equitable international order of private associations. And you list a number of them, such as the G30, the Council on Foreign Relations, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, and others, which are sometimes perceived as promoting world government outside the UN context, end quote. So, maybe just to start, could you expand on these groups you mentioned and what you think their agenda is? As you say, they want to work outside the bounds of the law and the UN. And, many listeners are fascinated. So I think this is a good place kind of to whet our appetites before we move on.
Well, it's clear to you, and it's clear to me, and it's clear to many others that the name of the game is to let the rich remain rich, and let's keep the poor poor. I mean, you want to keep the status quo so that the billionaires can enjoy their billions, notwithstanding the fact that there are also billions of human beings in Africa and in Latin America and in Asia who are starving to death. And you want to maintain this system that allows for hoarding all of the vaccines and forgetting everybody else in the world. It is a system that is so unequal, so undemocratic. I mean, I am pushing, and that would have been a subject for the so-called Summit for Democracy of Joe Biden. I would like to see a world where there is international, not only national, international democracy meaning participation. That the voices of small countries, poor countries, are also heard, that they have some influence in the policies of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization. They are left behind. They're forgotten. Nobody cares about them. And democracy. I mean, if Joe Biden is talking about democracy, how about doing away with the Electoral College? How about doing away with gerrymandering in the United States? It's an endemic problem. How about ensuring that everybody can vote? But that is not what the system wants. There is an enormous public relations effort to sell the United States model as the model for democracy. Whereas back in 2005, you had the World Summit. That was a truly inclusive World Summit. All 193 states that were there, and observer states, and the Vatican, and so on and so forth. And they produced Resolution 60/1, the outcome document. And in paragraphs 135 and 136, they actually go into the issue of democracy. And they say very clearly, no country has a patent on democracy. It's not one size fits all. There are many models of democracy, and the United Nations should help all countries find their own way. All countries should have a homegrown democracy. And what is democracy? Democracy is the correlation between the will of the people, or rather the will of the majority, taking due account also of the rights of the minority, but the will of the people and the laws and policies that affect them. That is what democracy is all about. Democracy, ruled of, by, and for the people, is what we are striving for. On the other hand, the United States understands democracy as periodic elections. Point final. That's about it. The only thing that counts is that every 2 years you can vote for some figurehead who's going to be your senator or your congress person, and every 4 years you can vote for someone who is actually not a leader. Joe Biden is not a leader. Trump was not a leader. It's someone who is going to be doing the bidding for somebody else who really has the power. I mean, as I said, those who govern are not elected, and those who are elected do not govern. I mean, those who are elected follow the orders of what you call the deep state, follow the orders of the great interests, economic interests, of the military, industrial, financial complex. And both parties in the United States converge, and also in many other countries also. But if you look at the political landscape in the United States, whether you are Democratic or Republican, both parties are for militarism. Both parties are for exceptionalism. Both parties are for interventionism. Both parties are for Wall Street. Both parties are for Israel and against the Palestinians. Both parties are for the Monroe Doctrine, if you want, and for manifest destiny. And with this self-serving conviction that we are by definition the good guys. And I say, wait a minute, how about Matthew 7? Have you ever heard about looking at the speck in the other guy's eye and not realizing that you also have some disabilities in your vision? Shouldn't you be sweeping at your own doorstep? That is simply not part of the narrative. You won't read it in the New York Times, in the Washington Post. You will not hear it in CNN or in Fox. We are being indoctrinated into believing that we are the good guys and we can tell everybody else what democracy is all about. The absurdity of inviting this despotic hothead called Boris Johnson, but not inviting Viktor Orban of Hungary. The idea you have a democracy summit, but you leave billions of people out. You leave 1.4 billion Chinese, and you leave the Russians out, and but you put in the world's largest democracy, India, that is committing crimes against humanity in Kashmir, that have killed tens of thousands of Kashmiris, that have denied the self-determination of Kashmiris, etc. But they are the world's largest democracy, and they could participate in this exclusive club that Biden, in his imperial narcissism, invited. So you see my preoccupation with epistemology. Language is being hijacked. Language is being corrupted by government. Politicians have lied since time immemorial. It doesn't surprise me. If you go to Pompeii, you will see the political statements, even the cartoons that they had for the elections in Pompeii back 70 BC, 70 AD, as the case may be. Politicians, you expect them to lie. But you also hope that in a democracy, you're going to have a free press, and the press is going to be the watchdog that is going to be pointing at the crimes of government, at the abuse of government, at the breach of the rule of law by government. But how many conglomerates do we have now? I think it's down to 6 or so. There are about 6 conglomerates that control all the media, that control all the information that we get, which means they can disseminate as much fake news as they want.
This was actually, I wanted to bring this up, but before mentioning that, you had some really great quotes on elections and democracy that I wanted to read out. Very colorful. You say, quote, "Many elections are bogus, in the sense fake elections, because the population only echoes the propaganda it has been fed, and contending parties offer no real choice, leading to a straitjacket of pseudo-democratic ritual elections. If the only choices possible are between candidate A and candidate B, whose programs are often very similar, in such cases, the two-party system avers itself to be only twice as democratic as the one-party system," end quote. So I love some of the stuff.
Or in China. Well, it is true. I must say, I think that there is probably more plurality of views in China, or more plurality of views in Cuba than in the United States. Because in the United States, there is such pressure of political correctness that you think, in order to belong, that you have to go along with what you read in the New York Times or in the Washington Post. Whereas in Cuba, everybody knows there's only one party. But then within that party, there are many views. There, shall we say, within the Cuban Communist Party, there are those people who are far more to the right or to the left, than the single party. The name of the game, the test, the litmus test of democracy is whether you actually have participation. Does the government consult the population? Does the government care about what the population thinks? Does the government go out of its way to find out what people feel? Does the government inform the people? Or do we have a system whereby people are getting fed only a certain amount of information and dissenting views are simply suppressed? And that we know in the United States. If you are a dissenter, if you are a journalist who does not agree with the editorial line of CNN or of Fox or the New York Times, you're fired. And that's it. I mean, that is, of course, freedom. It's private enterprise, we can fire you. And of course, you get fired.
Yeah, and just to add, again, you write a lot about this in your book, and in your reports you've talked about that the democratic deficit and the need for democratic controls so that the protective functions of the state are not undermined. You've said there's little hope for an international democratic order as long as democracy is lacking at the national level, end quote. And you discuss the censorship by governments and the private sector, techno giants, as you call them, in our new digital society, which has become Orwellian. And I often see you tweeting about this angrily. And you, in your book, you mentioned the work of Nils Melzer and the dangers of our move toward totalitarianism. And you also complain a lot about the EU. So again, we have this like techno-Orwellian censorship.
This book came out original German, Der Fall Julian Assange. It's coming out in English, translated by Nils Melzer himself, because I asked him, Nils, for Christ's sake, why didn't you write the book in English? I mean, it's, Nils is from Zurich. He's a Swiss German. So his mother tongue is German. So he wrote the book in German, managed to get it published in one of the best publishing houses in Germany, Piper. So I'm very happy that it came out in Piper and not in some alternative publishing house. But in the United States, he only got Verso Press in New York, which is a fairly alternative publishing house, but at least important that it will be in English. But as far as Nils Melzer is one of the rapporteurs whom I really respect. I mean, I would say 20% of the rapporteurs are independent and good and committed. The others are comfortable individuals, careerists, opportunists, who want to use the post of rapporteur to jump to something bigger and better. And of course, they don't want to burn their fingers. So they only attack those countries that you can attack safely, like Belarus or Russia or China. Well, but they wouldn't touch the United States, or they wouldn't touch France or Germany, etc. So back to this incredibly important book. I mean, I call, and I did 2 reviews of this book. I called Nils Melzer the Emile Zola of the 21st century. Now, to remind listeners, Emile Zola, a prominent French journalist at the end of the 19th century, who in a very famous article called J'accuse, I accuse, as a whistleblower, he blew up the frame-up of this young Jewish captain in the French army, who had been just simply framed up by the military, and he had been convicted of espionage for Germany. Now, in any event, it was shoddy, but when the article came out, it became a scandal, and rightly so. And the result was that the conviction was lifted, and Alfred Dreyfus was again liberated. So that was at a time when the press was, shall we say, somewhat independent. Today, that would not happen. Today, a whistleblower gets put in jail. They frame him up with a completely false accusation of sexual harassment and rape and all sorts of things that had to be, of course, discontinued because there's nothing to it. But that forced them to flee into the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And then when the government of Rafael Correa in Ecuador ended and the new President Lenin Moreno came in power, Lenin Moreno, in exchange for a nice IMF loan, he stripped Assange of his refugee status. And if there's anybody who has a right to refugee status, anyone who can invoke the Geneva Refugee Convention, it's Julian Assange. He's a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution. He definitely does. He's already been persecuted for more than 10 years. And what Nils Melzer divulges in his book is so much worse than what Emile Zola did in the Dreyfus affair. There you had a dysfunctional military court system. It was a wrong judgment against Dreyfus, had to be corrected and was corrected. But what Nils Melzer, and he's professor of international law, professor of human rights law, head of the human rights department here at the Graduate Institute at the University of Geneva. He knows what he's talking about. What he does systematically, he reveals the breakdown in the rule of law in the United States, United Kingdom, Sweden, and Ecuador. I mean, chapter after chapter, it is tough reading because you can't accept that your government is doing these things. You cannot accept this kind of, shall we say, obscene lawfare using the machinery of the administration of justice to destroy justice, to destroy a human being. Because obviously, what should have happened as a result of the WikiLeaks disclosures in any civilized world, what should have happened is that major investigations would have been conducted by the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, into the use of drones, into the killings and torture, the whole complex of torture in Afghanistan and in Iraq. There would have been investigations, commissions about torture in Guantanamo, about the illegality of the so-called extraordinary rendition program, which was solidly condemned by the UN Rapporteur on human rights while combating terrorism. That was Ben Emerson, QC. He did a couple of reports concerning this issue of extraordinary renditions. And you would think that some alarm should have gone somewhere. But one crime leads to the next. So one cover-up leads to more covers-up, leads to more violations of human rights and of the rule of law in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, and in Ecuador. Now, when you realize the implications of the book, it's really frightful. But because people don't want to accept it, you don't want to accept that your government is acting unconstitutionally, that your government is breaching US law, UK law, Swedish law. And it's all documented.
Yeah, and I wanted to get kind of the further implications. So, and you mentioned rendition. So basically, Assange, his extradition or rendition to the U.S. has been approved, and meanwhile, he's suffered a stroke, because I think we can say he's been tortured for the years that he's been held in prison, and this kind of creates a legal precedent now where the U.S. or perhaps any country can extradite or rendition anyone anywhere for merely being a dissenter, as you previously mentioned. And I suppose in theory I could be renditioned for this podcast. And you've said in a recent interview that it appears that the U.S. establishment wants to punish Assange so severely that no future whistleblower will ever dare to do what Assange did. So
well,
I mean,
they have already punished him. I mean, they have ruined his life for the last 11 years. It's not just now. It's not just the ruling of this sold-out British judge. What I find here is that I'm not sure that they really want to try him in the United States. I don't think anybody wanted to try Jeffrey Epstein. I think they want him dead, period. And they're hoping that he will just die in Belmarsh because of the conditions he's been held there. And the doctors who accompanied Nils Melzer, who went to see Assange, confirmed that his state of health was very delicate and that he certainly would not survive being extradited. And but the United States gains anyway. He's bottled up in Belmarsh. And the mainstream media, the corporate media, the lying media, has maintained the defamation of Assange. I mean, there's a tremendous complicity on the part of the corporate media in creating a monster out of Assange. You have to study what the BBC writes about him, what the New York Times has written about him, what words they use, what adjectives they use to subliminally and sometimes very directly suggest to you that this man is a bad person. He's a really morally depravate. And so this kind of character assassination has been done quite deliberately by the press in Sweden, in Ecuador, in the United States, and in the United Kingdom. Now, my proposal has been to use anti-monopoly legislation and antitrust legislation to break down these conglomerates, because there's so much power being exercised by the media that democracy becomes impossible. Democracy can only function if you have access to all the information that you need in order to formulate your own opinion. If that access is cut off because only a handful of media moguls control all the information, then of course you're being manipulated. But one concern that I have is, by what right do they do that? And why doesn't the state step in and establish rules and regulations? Of course, we all want to have a free media, but we don't have it. I mean, the media has a social responsibility. The social responsibility is to guarantee the truthful information and the comprehensive information of the public so that they can democratically choose their own opinions. I mean, freedom of expression would be meaningless if it only meant that you have the right to echo whatever nonsense you heard last night in CNN. I mean, freedom of expression is precisely freedom to dissent, freedom to have a different opinion. That's the freedom that has to be protected, not the freedom to go along and to join bandwagons. So back to what I was saying, censorship by government is very bad. But government has at least a certain democratic legitimacy, because even if the system is very dysfunctional, Joe Biden has been so quasi-democratically elected. So the American government has a certain democratic legitimacy. Whereas, who has elected Murdoch, or who has elected the other media moguls? And they are exercising power. And I think every exercise of power must be subject to democratic control. There must be some kind of democratic control. Otherwise, you are being led to your own destruction. You're being fed wrong information, and you're being deprived of essential information, so that you cannot exercise your democratic rights. Nils Melzer condemns that, and I hope that when his book comes out, that he will be invited to Heart Talk in the BBC, that he will be interviewed by numerous prominent maybe Amanpour of CNN could interview him, and also by the French and by the German. I think an interview in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung would be necessary. It's probably the leading intellectual newspaper in Germany. Now, let me take advantage of the opportunity to ask for assistance from your listeners. My book is doing well. I understand from Clarity Press that it has been selling rather well, but it's not a question of money. I don't care about it. I'm writing a new book, also for Clarity Press. And the title of the new book is The Human Rights Industry. Why the human rights industry? I could have called it the human rights establishment, or the human rights system, or the human rights landscape. But it's an industry to the extent that the participants, the tools of the human rights system, whether it be the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council, whether it be the non-governmental organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Service for Human Rights, etc., are not acting, shall we say, in a manner consistent with the International Bill of Rights. They're not acting in a manner consistent with the Charter of the United Nations. I mean, the Charter of the United Nations has three major, shall we say, driving principles: peace, development, and human rights. Now, when you have non-governmental organizations and rapporteurs who, instead of advancing advisory services and technical assistance for states that requested and needed, instead of advancing multilateralism, advancing dialogue, advancing compromise, they're actually engaging in just naming and shaming and pointing fingers and saying, you're bad, instead of saying, look, we understand you have problems, and how can we help you? The approach that I have seen in the human rights establishment is wrong. It's a very imperial approach. I call it imperial narcissism. And we ought to define ourselves as the good guys, and that gives us the right to condemn the others. So what I'm asking from you and from other listeners is for concrete examples in your experience of double standards, of selectivity, of how to put it, of betrayal of the principles of the UN Charter and of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights by politicians, by diplomats, by international civil servants. I mean, it's particularly grotesque what the Organization of American States has been doing. I mean, the OAS, the way it connived and actually supported the coup d'etat against Evo Morales in 2019 in Bolivia, the way they manipulated their so-called election monitoring, something that they do in many countries in Latin America. I mean, the Organization of American States has really failed all the tests of democracy and human rights, in particular during these years under Luis Almagro. And I am particularly shocked about the way in which they wanted to recognize the credentials of an imposter. I mean, Juan Guaido is an imposter. Juan Guaido of Venezuela has not been elected to any post other than the post that he used to have in the old National Assembly. So for 5 years, he was a member of the National Assembly of Venezuela. But nothing in the Venezuelan constitution gave him any right or any legitimacy in auto-proclaiming himself interim president. I mean, that was an attempt at a coup d'etat, which probably in some other countries would have meant immediate arrest and condemnation for the rest of his days. On the other hand, he has not been touched. I mean, the government has not thrown him in jail. And the Organization of American States wants to give this individual some kind of legitimacy. I mean, what a massive breach of the OAS Charter.
I'm just
in the face of Articles 3 and 19 and 20 and 21 of the OAS Charter. I mean, this kind of interference in the internal affairs of a member state is unacceptable. Of course, by now, Venezuela is no longer a member of the OAS. And I would like to see Mexico actually turn its back on
this was my next question, since you brought up Latin America and Mexico and AMLO, and kind of how the OAS and some of these institutions seem to be failing, and AMLO is kind of taking more charge. In recent months, he has praised the UN as the best possible form, I guess, of world government. He said like a month ago, and he has suggested creating a North American Union or Latin American Union modeled on the EU. So he wants to kind of create a Latin American structure that I guess he says would work for the interests of the peoples here that we haven't seen thus far. And so what are your thoughts on what AMLO is doing?
The Grupo de Puebla is pushing for that also. But you may remember that back in 2010, the idea was aired of a purely Latin American and Caribbean organization, excluding the hegemon, excluding the United States and Canada, so that Washington would not be calling the shots for Latin America, but it would be the Latin Americans and the Caribbeans who actually determine what policies they want. So they did in 2011 create the Council of Latin American and Caribbean states, the CELAC. And the CELAC just had a meeting a week ago, and they've adopted some very good resolutions. I mean, they back, that must have been 2014, that the CELAC adopted a resolution declaring all of Latin America and the Caribbean a zone of peace. Already the Treaty of Tlatelolco in Mexico, some 45 years ago, already that treaty had declared Latin America a nuclear-free zone. But this CELAC resolution went beyond it. The CELAC resolution declared all of the territory of Latin America and Caribbean as a zone of peace. It's a good example for the world. I would hope that AMLO picks it up. And I would think that AMLO is in a position to help CELAC replace the OAS. Honduras, Nicaragua has now denounced the OAS charter, and rightly so, because the OAS has betrayed its principles so fundamentally that I think the only thing you can do with the OAS is to dissolve it. There is a replacement organization, the CELAC, and I think this would be the time, say, for Honduras, that now has a new president, Honduras to leave the OAS and to join, Honduras is already a member of CELAC, but to focus its activity within the CELAC and to strengthen the CELAC and to strengthen South-South cooperation and South-South solidarity. Again, I would, I'm an American citizen. There's nothing that I would like more than the United States doing away with the Monroe Doctrine and deciding that we would like, to cooperate with Latin America and not dictate to Latin America what they should be doing. We would like to be friends. You remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his good neighbor policy. I'm afraid that Presidents Ronald Reagan and Bush and Clinton and George W. Bush and Obama and Trump and now Biden have insisted on a hegemonial imperial policy whereby we have not a good neighbor policy, but a policy of, shall we say, the colonial power and the colonies. So, as the OAS has already been called, the Ministry of the Colonies. And that is the way that American presidents have seen the function of the OAS. So I think that AMLO, who I think still enjoys a high level of popularity in Mexico, has the, shall we say, the political weight to carry Latin America. I mean, he should give as much support as he can to governments that are being subjected to illegal sanctions, Certainly, the sanctions against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are unacceptable. They are contrary to international law. They are contrary to the OAS Charter, and they should be condemned. But unfortunately, human rights have been so much weaponized that, with complicity of the media, that the public, the general public in the United States, more or less, have accepted these sanctions against Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela because those are bad countries. So we want to starve them to death. It's like in the old medieval times that you would siege a town and then you starve them to death until they show their white flags. And now, of course, it's not just a town that is being put under siege, it's a whole country. And the cruelty of the sanctions is spectacular. As you know, I was the first UN rapporteur to go to Venezuela in 21 years. I was there in November, December 2017. And I went there with an open mind, and I spoke with everybody. I spoke with the National Assembly, with the opposition, with the Chamber of Commerce, Fede Cámaras, with the professors, the churches. Quite interestingly, the Church of Venezuela, or more or less most of the Church of Venezuela, has been in the opposition because it was the Church of the Rich. So they associated more with the parties of Julio Borges and of Capriles and Leopoldo Lopez, etc., etc. Whereas the Jesuits supported the social policies of the Chavez and now Maduro governments. So I interviewed all of these people. And the main message of my report was, look, there is a major economic crisis in Venezuela, but it has two reasons, two sources. The breakdown of the price of oil, because the oil was very, very high. It was nearly $150 at the time of the barrel. In the years 2012, 2013, and then it breaks in 2014 after Chavez dies. And then Maduro has to already deal with the fact that a country that is almost a one product economy, 95% of its currency came from sale of oil, found itself with half of that because the price of oil had been halved. And then, instead of trying to help the country navigate in this difficult time, then come in comprehensive sanctions, financial blockade, so that Venezuela could no longer buy and sell like anybody else. And investment was impossible because anyone who wanted to invest would have to pay a huge penalty to the U.S. Treasury. Of course, these measures are extraterritorial and are illegal. But what do you care that they're illegal if you have the power to impose them? And the United States has the power to impose them. So what happens is that most everybody just dropped Venezuela. I mean, it's too risky to do business there. I cannot afford, having to litigate with the United States. So I don't sell anything more. I don't buy or sell anything from Venezuela. So you have here a situation of an economic crisis. Yes, there is hunger. Yes, there is scarcity of medicines and any number of other problems. But who caused it? The United States. I mean, ex injuria non oritur jus. You cannot create a humanitarian crisis and then blame the Venezuelans for the humanitarian crisis that you yourself artificially created. You want to help the Venezuelan people? It's very simple. Lift the sanctions. Lift the financial blockade. Let them function like any other state. They have the largest oil reserves in the world. They have probably the second or third largest gold reserves in the world. They have bauxite, they have lithium, they have all sorts of things. It's a super wealthy country in natural resources. And if you allow investment to come in and to, shall we say, reconstruct the infrastructures that have not been able to be maintained, because if something goes wrong in a refinery or something goes wrong in the hydroelectric plant, you cannot buy the replacement parts because Venezuela was so dependent on trade with the United States that, of course, they didn't have a home industry that would make them self-sufficient, that would allow them to maintain all of these industries. So my report simply said the economic crisis is artificial. We have caused it. We have a tremendous responsibility vis-a-vis the Venezuelan people to pay reparation for the damage that we have done to them. And it's not just economic damage. Sanctions kill. And from Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot in their report 2019 that estimated that for the year 2018 alone, 40,000 Venezuelans had died as a direct result of the sanctions. And that was 18. In the meantime, 19, which has been worse, 20, which was worse, 21st, it's been worse. So I think it's easy to estimate that way over 100,000 people have lost their lives as a direct result of sanctions.
I wanted, in the interest of time, as our hour is winding down, I wanted to kind of end on a more positive or optimistic note. And people can go back. We did a more in-depth interview on Venezuela, and they can go and read your a report. But before kind of asking you about the more optimistic and best case scenario regarding the UN and UN institutions, a number of people, I have one more critical question to ask. A number of people have asked me to ask you. So you just mentioned previously, for example, the bad deal between Lenin Moreno, Ecuador, and the IMF as one example. And you've written also in your book about the negative impact of financial interests on human rights. You talk about the human rights industry. You've stated you recognize human rights problems arise from, commercial activity and financial interests, but you place trust in the existence of multilateral organizations like the WTO. But some of us, many of us are also concerned about the financial interests in the area of health. You've said you generally think UN agencies like the World Health Organization do good work. But, we're hearing some people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. come out and saying that there are some issues with the WHO and, big pharma to an extent. There's some elements of capture and the promotion of their products. And, what insights or thoughts would you have, in the time of this public health crisis, conflict, problems regarding the WHO and criticisms of institutions
certainly
such as
the WHO, like many agencies of the United Nations, can benefit from reform that requires reflection, that requires options. We must consider which are the contingency plans that we can have for the improvement of the functioning of the WHO. There are influences. Certainly, China weighs on WHO, as does the United States, directly and indirectly, because there's the blackmail of the United States. If you don't do what I tell you to do, you don't get any money. That's blackmail, nothing else. It's bullying. And certainly, there are failures in the system. I personally know Tedros. I can send you very nice pictures of me with Tedros. And I've spoken to him. I've discussed matters with him. I've made suggestions to him with regard to a post-COVID social contract, with regard to a post-COVID pandemic preparedness treaty. And they're moving on that. I mean, a new treaty for preparedness is now being drafted. So I think that I've had maybe a little bit of influence, but I don't idealize any of these organizations. I think that the United Nations is very imperfect, but if we didn't have it, we would have to invent it. The ILO is imperfect, but if we didn't have it, we would have to invent it. And I think that all of these organizations advance the idea that we are all in this planet. We're all in the same boat. We have global problems which can only be solved globally, and it's not only the pandemics, it's also climate change, and it's also the danger that an asteroid might again hit planet Earth, and we have to have contingency plans for that. We must be prepared, and that can only be done globally. Unfortunately, 40% of our budget in the United States goes into the military. Now tell me, why in the name of God do we need a $1 trillion military budget? To finance more drones and artificial intelligence and lethal autonomous weapon systems, otherwise known as killer robots, and more nuclear submarines, etc., etc. Should we not be concentrating on preparedness in the field of health, pandemics, vaccines, etc.? Should we not be prepared for volcanic eruptions? I mean, we're terribly concerned about climate change. Me too. But you realize what would happen if the super volcano under Yellowstone Park blows up, or if the super volcano in the Vatnajökull in Iceland blows up, or one of the many big volcanoes in Indonesia. I mean, that will significantly pollute the atmosphere. The billions of liters of ash that will be sent up into the atmosphere. These are things that we have to be prepared to do something if that happens. And we're not doing it. We're just still in this mad consumerism, and we're only thinking about the next iPhone that we can buy, or the next gadget or junk that we can buy for Christmas or whatever. So I think that our priorities are wrong. There are plenty of people saying the right thing in the United States, except that they're not in the powerful positions. One of my heroes, if you want, is Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University. He is saying most of the right things, and so is Noam Chomsky, but they are not in a position of power in Washington where they could make things happen. But my concern actually is, well, I have many concerns, but my main concern is around the concept of world peace. The United States, I thought after Mike Pompeo that Antony Blinken would be a bit more reasonable. But he is spreading, fake news about China. He is making uncalled for allegations, evidence-free allegations of genocide in Uyghur, in Xinjiang. Now, the fact is, in the Uyghur Autonomous Republic in China, there are problems. There are problems in many parts of the world, but China has invited the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, to come and see for herself. China is, shall we say, interrelating with UN rapporteurs. It's interrelating with the UN system. It's not covering things up. And I think it is highly irresponsible for Blinken and for the media to be putting out these ridiculous accusations of genocide, which, by the way, I consider an insult to the real victims of genocide. I consider to call the alleged forced labor, etc., in Xinjiang, to call that genocide, when you realize that genocide really means the extermination of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire and by Kemalist Turkey, means the extermination of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, means the extermination of maybe 800,000 Rwandans during the Rwandan genocide. Those were genocides. We have a completely different situation in Xinjiang, and there's a lot of information on Xinjiang on the internet. You just go on the internet, do Xinjiang, you will find not only these evidence-free accusations, but you will also find a lot of solid information that has been put out by professors, that has been put out by the Chinese government. Of course, the Chinese government is open and publishes statistics and publishes all sorts of documentation. And then you will realize that this is not anywhere close to genocide. And if you think that there's a problem, support the United Nations in conducting an independent investigation. But it has to be independent, in good faith, objective. The problem with many United Nations commissions of inquiry is that they are already, the pre-selection who's going to be there is someone who's already committed against the country. It's like the case with the fact-finding commission on Venezuela. It's a disgrace. I mean, it's a farce. It's a masquerade.
You talk about this in your book, and I have one final question for you, maybe to end on a positive note. And one of the purposes of your book, where you build a case for a more just world order, you write, quote, "A democratic and equitable international order is one where the UN Charter is recognized as the world constitution and the ICJ operates as the world constitutional court," end quote, "and where peoples and nations enjoy representation in the UN and regional and financial international institutions." Just, going forward in the years ahead, maybe decades ahead, what do you see? Are you optimistic in terms of the UN system and the many other, systems, regional, multilateral, NGOs? Do you see kind of a slow general improvement or the maintaining of the status quo? What do you see going ahead?
Well, I think that as a practicing Catholic, as a Christian, I think it's my duty to be optimistic. It's my duty to try to indicate obstacles, identify problems, but also provide implementable, pragmatic solutions and recommendations. And I do observe that there are any number of prominent voices like Jeffrey Sachs, like Nils Melzer, like Alena Dohan, who are saying the right things. What we need, and that's my hope, that programs like yours, and I give interviews to Yuri Smouter in Belgium and to Rico Brouwer in Amsterdam and to all sorts of other interviewers and bloggers, etc., that gradually, thanks to the internet, and we will break the monopoly of the media and we'll get the information out to the people. Because my feeling, or my belief, my conviction is that the human being, with all his problem and with all his little jealousies and little ambitions, etc., the human being is basically good, and he wants to have a good life for his family, his children, his friends, etc. And that fails very often because he's being manipulated. He's being used by others. So to the extent that we can disseminate information and disseminate an optimistic narrative, I think there is indeed a legitimate expectation that we will come out of the low point that we have reached. But certainly we won't come out of it through fake exercises like the Summit for Democracy. Let me go back to the outcome document of the World Summit held in New York back in 2005 to celebrate 60 years since the entry into force of the UN Charter, 24 October 2005. There, that outcome document, Resolution 60/1, is a very optimistic document. And it has all sorts of not yet implemented proposals. I think that it would be worth for politicians to take the time to read that document again. In particular, paragraph 135 that talks about multilateralism and talks about democracy, international democracy, domestic democracy, and the fact that there's no one single model of democracy. And on this happy note, I think we can say for today, it was a pleasure to chat with you again. Give my best to your wife and kids, and to your sister and her kids. I am pleased to have had you both as students, and it is for me always a tremendous pleasure to stay in touch with some of my better students. And you are certainly not the oldest with whom I keep contact, because one of my better students, Roman Bode, when I was professor of international law in Chicago, he did a great paper for me, got an A, I remember. And he's been for many years now with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and it's now a successor organization because they've actually been winding up their work. And Roman Bode is living in Wassenaar in The Hague, and that is actually on foot from my house in Noordwijk aan Zee in Holland. It is about 4 hours on foot, and I've done it on foot. And it's about half an hour, 3/4 an hour by bike. I've also done it on bike. So again, enjoy the Christmas season. Try to relax a bit. try to keep safe. Corona is not gone, and pray to God that it does have a bit of mercy with us and it goes eventually away. But on this happy note, I do say goodbye because, as I said, I have to go now to a rehearsal, and we have a concert at 7 p.m. tonight to be repeated next Sunday, the 19th, the 4th of Advent.
Okay, I will. I have fond memories of Geneva. This feels like yesterday. A wonderful time. And yeah, so again, people can go to dezayasalfred.wordpress.com. You're on Twitter, Facebook, and they can go to Clarity Press to buy Building a Just World or Order. Enjoy this.
And help me with my new book, The Human Rights Industry. Anything that listeners know from personal experience of double standards, hypocrisy, selectivity, let me know about it because I can incorporate it, and I'll give credit and incorporate it into the new manuscript, of which I've already written 150 pages, but it'll probably be more in the neighborhood of a 500-page book.
All right. Enjoy the ski season in Switzerland.
Will do.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.